Hello and welcome to another episode of TMOlive, the Media Online's video series where we ask newsmakers the tough questions and explore the hot topics. I'm the site's multimedia journalist, Michael Bratt. This week we look at an ongoing court case which is gripping the media world. It's about publishing the identity of children involved in court cases. My guest to discuss this is William Bird, Director of Media Monitoring Africa. Thanks very much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So what is the bottom line of this court case? What is being argued?
So the bottom line is this is about protecting children's rights in relation to the media, and at the same time making sure that we protect and promote media freedom. So in essence, we're saying that we think that a child who's involved as a victim of a crime should not be named and identified as a default. Doesn't mean that they can't ever, but as a default they shouldn't be, their identity and name shouldn't be revealed. And we're also saying that once a child turns 18, and you then become an adult, obviously, we're saying that if there's certain proceedings that are taking place at the time, it should be the case that the child's identity remains protected. Otherwise, it seems a bit of a futile effort to protect a child's identity until that point.
What does current legislation say about identifying children involved in court cases?
So there are a range of pieces of legislation that deals specifically with children and media. So there's stuff around, there's a constitutional court order around children and divorce. There is a section on children and identification in the Maintenance Act. There's sections in the Child Justice Act, for example. But what we're talking about here and what this case is focused on is on sections in the Criminal Procedure Act. So that we're dealing with children involved in criminal proceedings or where there's a crime against them. And in essence, it's the section of the law that deals with when and where the media may or may not name or identify children.
So there's no distinction between whether they're victims or alleged perpetrators of crimes?
So at the moment there's a bit of a lacuna, right, which is that it talks about protecting children who are witnesses or accused and not necessarily victims, and we think that that's more of an oversight. Of course, also bear in mind this Criminal Procedure Act was drawn, I think it was amended in 1970-something or 1980-something. So these particular sections, you know, they had no cognizance of the social media reality we live in now. So this is really about saying that as a default position, media should not name or identify children that are involved in criminal proceedings who are victims of crime. So if, for example, like, if a child is involved if they have a horrible incident happen to them, they're subject of a home invasion or something, we shouldn't just go and name and identify them as in relation to that. And media often are quite careful about these things because there's also some very good ethical guidelines in the press code, but that sometimes these things are violated, and unfortunately it tends to happen to children that are the most vulnerable. And so we're saying rather than have a default that they can be identified, that default needs to be switched to don't identify unless you approach a court and the court says you can.
You talked about social media. Obviously you were looking at media houses, formal media houses.
Yeah.
What about those individuals who are on social media who may reveal the identity of children? How does the law relate to them?
Well, they'd be guilty of a criminal offence, whether they're part of a formal media house or not. And I think that people forget this, and this goes back to the general education we need around using social media. Just because it's there doesn't mean you should put stupid things on there as well, because people can see them. So if a person goes into court and takes a picture of a child who's in court as a witness or an accused, they're guilty of a criminal offence, whether they are themselves belong to a media house or not. So that doesn't really impact it. What we're talking about here, though, is saying if a child has gone through some kind of extreme trauma, which they generally have to end up in a criminal justice scenario, we need to make sure that we don't further aggravate that. And the evidence that was presented by the partners to this case, being NECRO and Childline, is that a child's identification in media can have very, very harmful impact on that particular child. In some instances, it can almost reset any of the progress that they've made, but it also definitely exposes them to secondary trauma and further harm. And the point here is that, what value do you derive by naming and identifying children? And that's the one question that the media themselves don't seem to be able to answer, or at least not with any conviction.
That was actually going to be my next question, is what does the media get out of identifying children involved in these cases?
So one of the things that they say is that there's a lot of public interest, and that a name helps sell and promote to newspapers, that people are more likely to buy or read a story if there's a name linked to it rather than if there isn't. But I don't necessarily support that idea. You know, for a range of reasons, you can use pseudonyms and you can be creative in the way that you tell these things. And we know, because we've got some brilliant journalists who do those practices where they tell very powerful stories without revealing the child's name or identity in any way. So I don't buy that. But even if you do buy that argument, you're saying essentially our interest in ultimately selling our product trumps the potential harm that may come to a child. Now that's a very different thing to saying public interest versus that child's best interest, right? That's a harder balance. But when you're talking about commercial interest versus a child's best interest, I think a child's best interest should win almost every time.
So what does Media Monitoring Africa want to see come out of this court case?
So what we're hoping to achieve is some level of clarity around the law, and obviously we need that for media and for human rights organizations like ourselves, so that we know how to engage and interact with media. So we're hoping for some clarity from the judge to say, in future, the default position will be don't name or identify a child who's a victim, but also once a child, if they're involved in those proceedings, once they turn 18, if there's been all of those steps put in place to protect them, it makes sense to then continue to extend that same protection once they turn 18. Otherwise, you get this awful scenario where you had with the Eugene Blanche murder trial, where one of the accused was under 18 at the time, and on the day of sentencing, it was his birthday, he turned 18, and they named and identified him. Suddenly he wasn't able to stay in the town anymore, he had to move, no one knows quite what happened to him, and all because he turned 18, and that's all because the justice system itself took a number of years, and that surely can't be fair. It doesn't seem right that then that arbitrary date then of becoming 18 would then undermine all of the significant steps that were taken beforehand to ensure his identity was protected.
So what's the next step for Media Monitoring Africa in this process and the court case itself?
So what we're waiting for now is we're awaiting judgment from this particular case, and then I guess we'll wait and see. There is an expectation, I think, on our side and probably by the media that this is likely to end up in Braamfontein, because I think we are dealing with some quite weighty constitutional issues, and I think that may well be appropriate that we do end up there, because we're dealing with people's lives and we're dealing with the media and media freedom, and both of those things are essential to our democracy.
Fascinating insights. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you.
That was William Bird, Director of Media Monitoring Africa. Until next week, it's goodbye from me.